In Romans 13, Paul addresses the topic of government. In this episode, David and I talk about the Christianly view of politics. As we interact in the world, how should we view government and engage in helpful conversations during this time of global tension? I'm your host, Aaron Miller, pastor of equipping at Grace Baptist Church in Santa Clarita, California. Welcome to Magnify.
We're engaged with the world, but married to Christ. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
I just made that up during chapel. I thought that was good.
It's those fine-lined differentials where you have common ground but not common value.
I was thinking about why people are conservatives on the political spectrum. And I would say, from my experience, mostly they are fiscal conservatives, and it has everything to do with how the national financial policies affect them personally in terms of money.
So it's money and comfort driven.
It's money and comfort driven. Then there also is a little bit that they use to buttress that to say, well, it's really about freedom. We want to be free. We don't want the government telling us what to do.
Well, I don't think that meant anything up until just a few years ago.
But what they also have very little of is moral conservatism.
Right.
Okay, they have financial conservatism because it's for them.
But morally, they're more like libertarians.
The thing is that they can't base their conservatism on a consistent worldview.
Right.
So, for instance, the Bible says there's a good place to be liberal, be generous and ready to share.
Right.
Give with liberality is the old term. And there's also this great restraint in terms of freedom. It restrains your freedom to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. It restrains your sexual freedom, your financial freedom, your moral freedom. It says, don't be conformed to the world, be transformed and conformed to the will of God. So eventually, I think one of the good stories we tell is that if you're going to be conservative, you've got to have a moral authority behind it.
I mean, liberal versus conservative, to talk about those ideas, you can only understand them if it's compared up against a constant, unchanging platform or pillar. So, for example, you don't know what liberal is unless it's compared to something that it bounces off of. Jesus was liberal according to the thinkers and the scribes and the religious leaders of his day. He's liberal up against that, you know.
Yeah, and I think he was. I think even in our terms today, I mean, he cared about people. He met people where they were.
Yeah.
You know, he cleanses lepers. If I bring it into modern world, the conservatives today don't want to be anywhere close to a leper.
Right.
That's why the liberals are the ones who want to take care of the homeless, so to speak, and the poor. But the way they do it is for their own gain. Mm-hmm. Okay? The way Jesus did it was for the kingdom.
To be biblically balanced, I think, depending on the room you're in and the conversation you're engaged with, you're either going to be liberal or conservative, depending on the topic of conversation and who you're engaging with. Yeah, you met with a guy last week. You were being interviewed by him, and compared to him, you're
liberal.
You're liberal.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, but you know the origin of that in England, liberal were the good guys.
Right. Classically.
Yes, classical liberalism was that the government was for the people, mm-hmm. and the conservatism was let's back off a little bit. Let's conserve things. Let's conserve our resources. The liberals were saying no. Let's use them to help people, but it went too far. Mm-hmm. So
where it gets dangerous in the church is where Christians associate being socially conservative with being theologically conservative. And it blurs the lines there.
You can't say it better than that. Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're doing today, folks. We're kind of talking about how we as Christians think about government, even globally. I think the past 50 years, we've not had as much global tension as we're experiencing today. So how should Christians think about it, engage with it on a kind of a marketplace level, whether we're in the workplace or we're out in the community, we're going to engage with politics locally, nationally, globally. That's what we want to do, and that's what we're going to dive into. And I have a quote from Mark Dever here. He says something very interesting that I think Jonathan Lehman quotes in another work of his, but before and after America, there was and will be the church. The nation is an experiment. The church is a certainty. And what we've done, unfortunately, at least how we function, is we put all our eggs in the basket of the country, of the nation, of the experiment, and we flip-flop those things. And when our hope is driven in that direction, that has a real potential to come back and bite us. And I think we felt that the past few years.
Yeah, I think COVID and the kind of roller coaster we're on in terms of political offices and elections, President Trump, President Biden, it's caused us to rethink very seriously, what's the relationship of a Christian in the church to being a citizen in the nation? There's a good book that Jonathan Lehman has written. It's called Political Church. And in it, he suggests that the church is an embassy of heaven. And if we really get down into the weeds, we'd have to say that the church is a political entity in a theological sense, in that we have a king, we have a membership, there is a way to become part of the kingdom, that is to accept Jesus Christ. There are rules, there is law, and there is a government. We are to be governed by the Spirit of God who lives within us. And as well, we defend ourselves from opponents, but we invite anyone to come in. So you can become a citizen of the kingdom. But the place that we as a church occupy is that we're an embassy of that kingdom right now, because we're actually citizens of a different kingdom than the one we're living in.
Right.
And so we have this dual citizenship, and the question is, which one is to dominate? And sadly, what we see sometimes is that Christians become so enamored with the power or with the financial conservatism that a certain political person or party would bring in, and we think, okay, our lives are going to be better, they're going to be more comfortable, more financial, we're going to have more freedoms if this. And that becomes, well, as Christopher Wright says in his book, Here Are Your Gods, he says that, that becomes a small god for us.
Yeah.
And we put energy into it. We worry about that more than we do about the people around us who don't know Jesus. And so in some ways, while we're a political entity, we are first and foremost the church.
So how do we balance that citizenship? It's a dual citizenship, right?
Yeah.
And I think church history is riddled with examples of governments that have been of great harm to the church, but has not been able to prevail against the church, as Jesus promised in Matthew 16.
Yeah.
Christians need to have a worldview of government, right? And certainly God uses government. It's ordained by God. I think Jonathan Lehman, in his book, How the Nations Rage, he gives kind of a threefold purpose of government in the Christian worldview. And the first one is to render justice. The secondly, he would say to promote peace and flourishing. And then thirdly, to provide a platform for God's redemptive purposes. Yeah.
What's interesting is in the history of nation building, there's always been a three-sided, well, I guess all triangles are three-sided. There's a triangle, and you have the side of government agency, and that's the side that tells you what you can and can't do, okay? And they enforce, that's the justice side. Then you have the educational side, and that tells you what you should know, if I could just simplify it that way. But there was always a third side, and that is the faith community, if you want to call it that. How do the people who are learning from the education and living under the government, what kind of people do they need to be? And that's where, the biblical worldview comes in. But in our case here in America, largely the faith community, it's given up its role to become part of the governing system.
Right.
And consequently, we're left out now.
Right.
I go to all kinds of public events here, Chamber of Commerce things, town meetings, town halls, and largely the faith community is not represented whatsoever.
Right.
And when they are, unfortunately, we are represented by those who are at war with the government,
Right.
at war with culture that nobody wants in the room. So one of my passions is to be involved in the city in a way, making relationships and being a place where people can see that Christians actually think. Jeremiah 29 is pretty important. It says that you should pray for the city, the welfare of the city, and that was written to those who were in Babylon,
Right.
and they were in, they had been captured. So in essence, they were to be an embassy of God there, even though they were slaves.
Right.
And he said, pray for the welfare of your city because its welfare will be your welfare.
Right.
So I think there's ample opportunity, ample purpose for Christians to be involved politically as long as you see it as and this is important, get this, as long as you see it as a pathway to bring your biblical worldview with you.
Right.
That means you can't be shaped simply by a conservative financial experience or desire, because we're supposed to be generous.
Right.
You can't be shaped just by overlooking the poor, the orphan, the homeless, because James tells us that true and undefiled religion is to take care of those who can't take care of themselves, the widow and the orphan in that case. And so much of our compassion as conservatives is driven by our financial concerns.
Right.
We don't want to downsize our own finances.
And I would say historically, Christians who have been convinced of a moral authority within the halls of government, they've gotten into a tug of war with culture that's not been helpful. Instead of recognizing that God has called the government to have one kind of authority and has called the church to have another kind of authority. And when we get into a tug of war with government trying to represent the moral authority over the nation, that's not what God has called the church to.
Right.
Jesus will bring the kingdom when the king arrives.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The sad thing is if we're honest, and by that I mean if we can really rid ourselves of the toxin of political bias.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by bias is that the other party's always wrong and ours is always right. If we get rid of that and just look at things factually, we'll find out that both sides lack a very moral component to their political ideology. It is almost all about getting reelected. It's all about power.
Mm-hmm.
And as a church, we fight with, it's something Thomas Hobbes said in his very famous book, Leviathan, back in the 1700s, talking about government, and that book was broken into 4 books, and the third one was his expose and talking about the whole idea of a Christian commonwealth. And he says this: the most frequent pretext of sedition and civil war in Christian commonwealths has a long time proceeded from this difficulty, and this is where I want to get to, of obeying at one time, both God and man when their commandments are contrary to each other.
Mm.
So in Romans 13 always comes up, Titus 3 always comes up. We're to be submissive, subject to the governing authorities. And so then what happens when the governing authorities are doing things we don't like? Are we supposed to obey? And that's been the real gray area, because it's easy to rationalize what I don't like as being contrary to God.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that in COVID.
Right.
Well, we don't want to wear masks. So they can't keep us from wearing masks because in church, we need to see people's faces. So that's really the battleground. And for me, I think we can't be that easily moved into disobeying the government. In the Bible, there are several cases, but each time, for instance, the Hebrew midwives were told to kill the Jewish their babies. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely against God's law.
Right.
So they didn't do it. And Daniel was told not to pray, and yet he prayed, and he got thrown in the lion's den for it. And then you got Peter and the apostles who were told you can't preach. During COVID here at Grace Baptist, we continued to meet because we had an outdoor amphitheater. We social distanced, we wore masks, but we did sing. The government told us we can't sing.
Right.
And we said no. In Colossians, we're commanded
Jesus
to sing.
tells us to sing. We're going to sing.
So
right.
Where we get into problems is when we start rationalizing that laws we don't like are actually sinful if we obey them. And I think we saw that in COVID. We've got to stay away from that.
Right.
Because in Titus 3, he says, not only be submissive, but he says, be obedient.
That's right. I mean, hey, who doesn't like freedom? I
Exactly.
love freedom.
Yeah.
But it is not a religious guarantee or a religious right.
And so often it just stems from arrogance. Mm-hmm. Who's that to tell me what to do? I'm a free American citizen. So we're right on the cusp of this right now, and we're seeing a greater divide amongst believers.
Yeah.
Those who believe that, as you said, if you're politically conservative, then that means you're theologically conservative, which doesn't happen to be true.
Right. Hey, Grace family, join us as we celebrate Passion Week. Our Good Friday service on Friday, April 7th starts at 7 p.m. in the Worship Center. We will remember the cost of our salvation through song, prayer, and studying God's Word, while not forgetting the victorious joy that Sunday will bring. This event will be recorded and live-streamed. Childcare is available up to 4 years old. Then come back on Sunday morning, April 9th, as we celebrate and rejoice in Jesus' resurrection. Bring your own fold-up chairs, warm clothing and blankets, and your whole family for our sunrise service in the outdoor amphitheater at 6:30 a.m. This event will not be recorded or live-streamed, and there will be no child care offered. Our mid-morning services will be at 8:45 and 10:45 a.m. in the Worship Center. These services will also be simulcasted to our outdoor patio. This event will be live-streamed at 8:45 a.m. Child care is available up to 4 years old. Hope to see you there. I mean, I remember how many conversations we had 3 years ago and have been ongoing ever since. Just trying to plead with people to understand that the church is not going to be the staging ground for the next American Revolution. That we're about the kingdom.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things you've said, Aaron, that I have now quoted several times is that we don't have a brand, we have a story. So let's rephrase that a little bit. We don't have a cause. We don't have a political cause. We have a kingdom story.
Correct.
And it's about a kingdom and a king. And, quite frankly, I don't know what's going to happen to our democracy, our republic. I like it, but whatever God brings about, we still have to be the church.
Talk to the folks a little bit about what God has afforded you in terms of influence here locally, because I think the whole local versus national influence is something that we have to address. God has called us to live here in Santa Clarita, right? We're in this town.
Yep.
And many times we get all wrapped up into a national discussion that is completely out of our reach, and it's not even where we're living.
Yeah.
God has opened up a few doors for you that we're thankful for. You've not pursued those opportunities, but they've come in your direction. How do you feel God is using you to speak into local platforms of influence?
Yeah, I want to really be careful here because I don't want to promote myself. I don't have a conference that want you to come to, or a book on how to be David Haig that you could come read. 12 years ago, I was at a golf outing. I was new in town. I was introduced to the man who was then the publisher of The Signal. Mm-hmm. And he said hi, and I said, hey, you run The Signal. How come you don't have a religions and ethics column? And he said, you want to write it? So kind of being caught in the moment, I'd never written a column before. So I said, yeah. So I've been writing every week for about the last 11 years in The Signal, and trying to demonstrate a biblical ethic and a conservatism that arises from the biblical worldview. For probably 10 of those years, nobody noticed. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, The Signal came out with their list of the 51 most influential people in our valley. And lo and behold, I didn't even know, but someone called me and said, congratulations, you're number 46. And I go, how can that be? I haven't done anything different this year than I did the last 10 years. And then the second year it happened, I'm number 26 now. So as a result, for some reason, the guy who's the mayor and others, I won't name names, but some of the large thinkers and movers and rich and powerful, they have a lunch that I've been invited to now, probably 3 times a week at a guy's house. And I'm sitting in the room and I'm going, I can't believe I'm here. But every time they say, David, would you please, bless the food? So I pray, and I have begun to just get to know these guys. One of them asked to have lunch with me personally. The other night, Sherilyn and I went to a function at one of the nonprofits in town that's county run and deals with children who are in need. And we were sitting eating hors d'oeuvres. There was one chair left. And a guy came and sat down, and turns out he's a big-time attorney in town. And now he reached out and said, hey, can we have breakfast? I'm having breakfast with him tomorrow. He's not a believer. And I don't know.
And that's the thing. We know that it's the Lord bringing these opportunities to you. You've not pursued this.
Right.
But we're thankful that God has brought them to. So inform the people listening, how can Grace Baptist family be praying for you? Because these keep rolling out, these opportunities, these invites.
Yeah.
How can we be praying for you and Sherilyn?
Yeah, Sherilyn's involved with one too. We met this couple at a restaurant, and we've been with them 5 times now. I mean, I think my number one goal is that I'm able to get to Jesus with these people. You know, they've asked questions, and I've given them a lot. We've had little sentences here and there in paragraphs, not written, but spoken here and there with all of them. Mm-hmm. They all know where I stand. They ask questions that are good questions. And it's that long road from meeting to the message. But the second thing, pray that will happen.
Yeah.
The second thing is I really am, my life motto is serving God by bringing his word to bear on his people. I don't need to be known. I'm not looking to do anything more than pastor a local church. Mm-hmm. I don't want to become what I see around me, where a lot of pastors become, I don't know, so full of themselves, and they're everywhere but their local church. And I'm here at Grace Baptist Church for the rest of my life, hopefully doing something that might be ushering, but as long as my legs will work, I want to do that. So those 2 things, that God would be glorified and I will be humbled.
Yeah. What was in your thinking last fall when we had those 2 local forums, right? We invited local elections. We invited people from all sides to come and listen and to be informed.
Right.
What was really your heart behind doing that?
Well, again, that Jeremiah 29, pray for the welfare of the city. So what we had was the city council, and then we had the various school boards, mm-hmm. all of which are nonpartisan, at least on paper. And so I just thought, wouldn't it be great? We have this great auditorium. Wouldn't it be great if the city of Santa Cruz began to see Grace Baptist as a safe place to go and hear the views of those people that are going to make the big, important decisions about their children's education? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's number one in my mind. And then also about the future of our city, the safety of our city, the growth of our city. That's the city council. And I thought it was great. It was nonpartisan.
Yeah.
Now, transparency, I tried to get the partisan people to come. I tried to get the Congress, mm-hmm. the congressional race, and the assembly race, but they didn't want to come because it was, I don't know if it was because of church or what, and that turned out better for us.
Right.
Because we would say we are more about the foundations of our city than we are necessarily about the national politics.
What sort of responses did you get from people in the community?
Well, they live streamed it, and last time I looked, there were 4,700 people who watched. Huh. So there was a great response in terms of we were useful. We provided a useful thing for the community. People in the church thought it was great.
I was going to ask, what were the responses in the church?
I got no negative responses.
Okay, good.
Not one.
Yeah, sometimes you never know what you're going to step into. It was the first time we had ever done something like that.
Right, and I think we did it well.
Well, brother, as we're kind of landing the plane here, what would be some helpful resources to help people think through the Christian worldview of government and how Christians approach politics?
Yeah, well, I'll list 4 of them. We've already talked about. Christopher J.H. Wright wrote a book called Here Are Your Gods, and it's really about being faithful in idolatrous times. And he talks about money as an idol, politics can be an idol, and he's really, really good. It's a small book. It's very accessible. Christopher J.H. Wright, that's W-R-I-G-H-T, Here Are Your Gods. Every Christian should read this. Secondly, we mentioned Why the Nations Rage by Jonathan Leeman. That's a more accessible and smaller version of his larger tome, which is called Political Church, Church as the Embassy of Christ's Rule, and we've quoted from that. That's a bit of a slog, it's a bit of a tough read.
Yeah.
The first third or so is written for the academic world, the political ideology, but man, the last half, when he gets into what the church is about, it's all biblical, and I found it fascinating. I'm still trying to put it all together. And then, much more simple, Michael Brown, who all my friends are concerned that I recommend him. He's a charismatic theologian, but he's a great writer, and I think his charismatic leanings actually are within the nice view, the nice circle of orthodoxy. He's a good guy. But his is called The Political Seduction of the Church. And he's talking to millions of American Christians who have confused politics with the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they think that we're going to, in some way, they don't say it, we're going to bring in the kingdom, we're going to get people, that we're going to force them to be moral, we're going to force them to be fiscally conservative, and if they don't like it, then when we get in power, we're going to do to them what they've done to us. And he brings up the idea in Romans 12 that we're not to pay back evil for evil. And so he's well written. He's a good read. Michael Brown, The Political Seduction of the Church.
Yeah, these are important conversations to keep having with the church, because I don't think we're out of what started or sparked a few years ago. We're still in a very frayed and fractured country, and how the church thinks about politics and how we think about God's use of government needs to be in our headspace when we're going to the voting booths and when we're evangelizing and sharing the love of Christ.
The thing is, the love of Christ is supposed to bring unity, and if the church is a means of division or is contributing to the massive division in our country, we are never going to achieve the purposes, the usefulness that the master of the house has for us. So the last thing I'd say is, as a believer, your politics should start on your block. By that I mean caring for and praying for and witnessing to the neighbors, the people in your sphere of influence, at the gym, on the sideline of your kid's game, in the classroom, wherever you are. Be a political force, not American politics, but the politics of the kingdom of God, grace and truth, and be useful there.
Amen. Thanks so much, Dave. Appreciate you, brother.
It's always a pleasure, Aaron.
Well, folks, thanks so much for streaming in. Hopefully you're able to join us next week as Jared Burkholder and I sit down with a very, very special guest. It is my wife. Thanks for streaming. Thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure to subscribe to Magnify Podcast so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. We would love to hear from you, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask in our mailbag, you can email them to magnify@gracebaptist.org, and we will answer them on the show. Thank you so much for streaming.